Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge Company. So many of the questions being debated today by the candidates for mayor make me want to talk to Michael Sorkin. He's a distinguished professor of architecture and director of the graduate program in urban design at CUNY City College, as well as the principal of the Michael Sorkin Studio in New York City. He also chairs the nonprofit Institute for Urban Design, and in between somehow finds the time to write hundreds of articles and books and lecture around the world. He's deeply committed and an influential architect, an urbanist who teaches and practices the importance of the public realm and the social implications of architecture, and he's my guest today. The dialogue today about, hello.
Greetings.
The dialogue today about the city being two cities, and the meaning, I guess, the rich and they're saying middle class. I want to add middle class and poor. How can we ever change that, especially with design and planning in the city? Can we?
I don't know that design and planning are exactly the key. I mean, maybe a species of planning, which is a social planning or an economic planning.
Combination, the kind of thing you like to talk about, basically.
Yeah. Certainly your observation is correct, and clearly something that should be debated by the next mayor. We have become two cities. You know, our poverty rate is appalling, and more than 20% of people in New York are living under the poverty line. We are creating two cities. I think that's aptly put. What to do is not entirely clear. I am somebody who certainly believes that government has a role. The idea that we've grown up in a culture that has increasing contempt for government, that believes that big centrally organized solutions will never cut it. I think maybe we have to rethink some of those assumptions. One remembers that after the Second World War, we built tens of thousands of public housing units. The waiting lists are very long. I think this is an appropriate role of government, is to step in and to provide for those who are least able to provide for themselves.
It's interesting, the people in the city of New York, I think, believe in government, but then we're reliant on the federal government and the other the avenues of revenue, I guess. You wrote in one of the books, and I have to read it because I can't remember it, the dialogue of desire and demand is a central generator of architectural form. Now, I'm interpreting that as the desire and demand. The desire has been on the part of basically the rich in the city, finance community, the developers. And so what we're getting are more housing, office buildings, all of these things that cost lots of money. But the citizens' demand hasn't been strong enough to change the equation.
I think that's not exactly what I meant. You know, I am interested in the kind of a city in which the panoply of desires is empowered. So that means not simply the desire of the rich, which often represents itself. I think part of the reason that we talk so much about architecture and design nowadays is as a way of not talking about other more fundamental issues, things that can be expressed in design, but we use good design to kind of paper over our failure to talk about more relevant issues. There's a term of art. A lot of people talk about the right to the city nowadays. And there are groups that are organized in order to discuss this. It comes from a French urban philosopher who wrote about this about the same time as the May events of 1968. And he spoke about the importance of a generalized right to the city. And a lot of people understand this simply as meaning that one should be able to access the different parts of the city, we should be able to go anywhere, one has one's rights in space. But the deeper meaning, which is most important, is the idea that the right to the city involves the right to have the kind of city that is the expression of your deepest desires, to create a new kind of a city, to think about the city of the future and see it materialized. You know, over the years, we've done various things to try to institutionalize the power of the disenfranchised in creating the right to the city. One of the things was the creation after the charter revision of the community boards with their capacity to make local plans. But, as you know, there's no power behind the plan. It's an expression of desire, but then there's no mode of making sure that these desires are realized and recognized by the highest authorities who tend to go their own way.
So bringing it into politics and into that, if there's a mayor who sees the city as a whole instead of sectionalizing it the way I think they do nowadays. There's no master plan, is there? There was a master plan in the 60s, but it was never adopted, was it?
The master plan was never adopted. That's right.
Do we want a master plan?
I'm somebody who's in favor of big plans. You know, the question is, once you do a master plan, what becomes of it? And it's also true that in the Bloomberg administration in particular, we have a kind of series of not completely irresponsible master planning exercises that have taken place. So the Plan YC, for example, is in its way an excellent document. It's very good on environmental issues. A lot of it is just bromides, and there's no route to institutionalizing lots of the elements of the plan, but that's a plan.
And the way they've done it is by zoning, basically, isn't it?
Well, that is the medium of planning in virtually every American city, is zoning. And certainly a very big percentage of the city has been rezoned in the Bloomberg administration, mainly involving a series of upzonings, which are controversial, to put it mildly.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because that's the topic right now, the East Midtown rezoning.
Yeah.
The rush to get it in, is that ego and the wanting to have that impact. But that's what I think misleads people, because that's to make a lot of money, basically, right? It's for corporations.
Absolutely. I mean,
it's for ambitious developers who are already very rich.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the rush is that, you know, our plutocrat mayor is seeking to engorge the people who keep him in power, which is to say real estate developers. You know, why one needs to upzone this place, which is so dense, I do not know.
And because he's also got other places around the city that they're also developing with the same use, it seems.
Yeah.
Hudson Yards, downtown Long Island City. Well, that's more suburban, isn't it? I mean, more urban, more living.
Well, Long Island City is more living, but I mean, there's the theory that there will be 4 downtowns in New York City.
Oh, that's interesting. But well, that goes with what you think, isn't it? Sort of decentralizing.
Well, I am for some decentralizing and disaggregating, and certainly one of the things that could be done by way of spreading the wealth around is to make sure that development takes place in neighborhoods where people actually need jobs. Whether or not the kinds of jobs that the city is creating are possible for those communities, not clear, which brings up the question of education. But the idea that we're going to be this polycentric metropolis with Midtown, downtown Brooklyn, and Queens Plaza as our major downtown nodes, well, that's a beginning.
Those areas, though, are for businesses that are pretty successful. It's certainly not for small business, because the rents for small business will be prohibitive, and the housing will be missing.
Absolutely not. So there's a bit of a divide between this reverence for entrepreneurialism and startups and small business, you know, which we hear endlessly, and the fact that we are providing by way of development primarily office space for big businesses and the corporate rich.
So your city, what would we do? What makes the city really livable and success? I mean, New York City is a great city, isn't it?
The greatest, I mean, I can't imagine living anyplace else. But we're certainly losing something. I mean, it's always not entirely black and white. You know, one of the cities I've lived in was London, where I was in the kind of swinging early 70s days. And one of the things about London, which now is reflected in the kind of pattern of life in New York City, is London was not so concentrated. It was possible when one was kind of going through slack or marginal times to live almost any place in London, despite the distance. So to some degree, the fact that kids are now living in Bushwick, and you know that the kind of spread of bohemian bobo culture is now expanding to Queens and Brooklyn and the other boroughs. There's something positive about that. But if you look at the mappings of incomes in communities in New York, virtually all of these expansions is accompanied by a displacement.
Exactly.
So although you can see in the statistics and the charts that the income levels are going up, that the quality of life is improving, it is generally also the case that in some adjacent community the quality of life is going down. So the idea that Dan Doctorow has always liked to be quoted as saying, growth is good, his Gordon Gekko line. Well, growth isn't always good. It's not an absolute thing. It's growth for whom, it's growth where, it's what kind of growth, it's differentiation within the field of what grows that's really important for the city.
So what do we do? I know some working people who are making $35,000 or $40,000. They're moving to the Poconos in Pennsylvania, so the travel time for them to come to work. I mean, we just keep spreading it, right? Yeah. On the other hand, we're getting the more affluent, older people from the suburbs coming in.
Yeah.
So we're causing more back and forth.
There's no simple answer. There's a complicated answer that has to do with housing affordability on the one hand, and the availability of meaningful employment for the range of citizens who live in New York City. And in between, there is the problem of education. The fact that we are not training people for the kinds of jobs that they should be getting. So you read off this impressive list of things that I do at the beginning. I need to add one more. I have a little nonprofit organization called Terraform, which does research into urban subjects. And the piece of research that we've been working on for the last 6 years, inshallah we will publish the first volume before the end of the year, it is an investigation of the possibility for New York City to become self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. Yeah? The idea that our so-called ecological footprint could become coterminous with our political footprint. Mm-hmm. So we are looking at what the kind of limits of producing self-sufficiency within the political boundaries of New York City are, and very interesting results. Obviously the demographic profile would be shifting. Obviously the employment profile, if we needed to provide everything, for the food and the manufactured goods and the energy and the clean water within the boundaries of the city, we would have to train and employ people to do this range of things. So the kind of the inspiration for this is the idea, at the global scale, that things are very much out of control. That we live in an era of incompetent nation states and overly powerful transnational corporations. And I've always believed that the democratic bulwark against the loss of our rights in this context is the city, is the increased autonomy of urban areas, which seem to me unique increments for democratic governance and for neighborliness. So we are looking at the possibility that a city would say, we really want to take responsibility for our place in the planet. We do not want to burden our neighbors. We do not want to produce more waste than we can responsibly deal with ourselves. And so we've been in the midst of this thought experiment, as I say, for about 6 years, and are beginning to learn some interesting things.
It certainly needs a lot of thinking, doesn't it?
It does need a lot of thinking.
It's endless.
The idea of autarky is not exactly fashionable, although on the one hand, there were kind of passionate advocates for self-reliance like Jane Jacobs. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's kind of Kim Il-sung and Hitler. So it's a strange collusion. But certainly, if anything interesting is happening in global politics nowadays, it is a move towards a strong sense of localism, that the neighborhood, the community becomes the increment not only of resistance, but of development. And we're just looking for...
But in that localism and everything, the role of government is what? Strong.
Sure. Well, I believe in strong government if it's democratic government, of course.
Right. How do we interest the public more into being a counterweight to other interests that the government seems to respond to more?
Well, this is politics. One of the nice things about New York is we're a bit more politically engaged.
And you're an architect who is politically...
Yeah, since birth, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. But one of the things that I think is beginning to make a difference is the fact that people are more and more concerned about the environment. We just had Hurricane Sandy. It's hot as blazes out there. I think people are beginning to realize that it's not going to go on forever. The globe is in trouble, and that the designated authorities are powerless or incompetent or unable. I mean, my God, you turn on the television and there is Mitch McConnell jawing on about how global warming is a hoax.
Nothing.
You know, these kind of anti-empiricists in Congress, it's absolutely ludicrous. So I think people who are rational and sensible to the fate of the collectivity will want to take action. So we're seeing all sorts of interesting things happening in New York. There's a lot of community organization, you know, community-supported agriculture. People are growing lettuce in Brooklyn, you know, on the rooftop. So I think at the grassroots level, there is a rising consciousness. Also, in a sense, you know, green has become the new red, by way of the organization of local politics.
Yeah.
So I think this is a lever by which I think a certain amount of progress can be made. You know, and Bloomberg, you know, the great anomaly, the great mystery. You know, to his credit, has pursued a pretty strong environmental agenda. You know, we've curbed our carbon emissions substantially. He has, God bless him, planted 750,000 trees in the city, which makes a big difference at every level. But there's so much more to be done. It's a beginning. And you know, one of the phrases one uses from time to time is the idea that politicians tend to greenwash things. So one talks a good game about the environment, but you know, for example, I mean, an architectural example, you know, the giant Bank of America building on catty corner from the library, from the public library. This was touted as being incredibly green. And you know, it seemed counterintuitive that a completely sealed giant office building would be green, you know, would be so sustainably green. Recently, it turns out that the Empire State Building, in fact, is much more energy efficient, probably because you can open the window. The simplest solution is the one that one needs to address first, is that rather than installing elaborate computer programs in order to turn the air conditioner on and off or modulate the lighting levels, sometimes it's easiest to open the window. And this is also true at the scale of the neighborhood, which I believe is the fundamental increment of organization in democratic cities. So, for example, if we're talking about a sustainable neighborhood, you know, if a neighborhood, you know, in this context, is a place in which you can walk to school, you can walk to work, you can walk to culture, you can walk to commercial activity, you can walk to recreation, you can walk to the park.
To the market for local food.
Yeah, exactly. Then you solve the transportation issue on the demand side. And one always looks at the demand side first, I think, as a planner and an architect. So you create a walkable neighborhood, which reduces the need for automobiles, and you also create a mixed neighborhood. You know, if the predicate of the successful neighborhood is that everything is available, then you need everyone's participation. That it doesn't become a class-based neighborhood. All the services need to be provided in the neighborhood. They're all within walking distance, so everybody should live there. And when one plans, then one needs to think in terms of economic planning of the array of jobs and services that one needs to have a complete life. So this is my fantasy about the reorganization of the city, which is not such an elaborate fantasy, which is simply that we continue to develop what's great about New York, which is we are very strongly rooted in neighborhoods, that there is continuity in neighborhoods, and I want to simply ratchet up the level of self-sufficiency in neighborhoods.
But you're not going to necessarily destroy the ethnic characteristic of a neighborhood or something like that. It stays.
I certainly would never
But we
want
would
to.
like to do at least the class and income.
But this is always the question of the city, is that what gets stabilized and what is subject to change. You know, there's a difference between ghettos and neighborhoods, but it's not an absolute difference. People should be able to enjoy their affinities.
Do you define a ghetto as being unable to get out?
Exactly. I mean, a ghetto is a neighborhood with no choices, in which you are obliged to live with your kind. So it's without freedom of choice. So, you know, as a social proposition, you know, how you the word engineer is not quite right, but how you conduce the idea that one moves freely and yet one's choices abide, you know, that's difficult. That's the task of democracy and of planning.
It's so interesting because, I mean, the 1%, it basically, I think, is true. The 99% and the 1%. And all the enthusiasm that we had down on Wall Street 2 years ago, it's 2 years now, was so dampened the minute they closed that right to assembly, the Zuccotti Park, and offered no alternative. When you think about it now in the city, it's very hard for large assemblies. I mean, in Central Park, we have the Central Park Conservancy, which is an elite group, basically. Then we have the space that's privately owned, or the space the city is closing off. What do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the great ironies about the Occupy movement, is that it was because of an anomaly in the legal structure that private park was open 24 hours a day. I mean, to me, the tragedy, which was certainly evoked by that assembly in Zuccotti Park, was that directly across the street was a place that I certainly argued from the get-go should have been our great site of public assembly. I mean, because
the World Trade Center
the World Trade Center site. Democracy reproduces itself in space, in the most primal form, in free assembly. I've just come back from Athens, and had dinner across from the Agora, the great locus classicus for free assembly. And it's true. I mean, instead of creating a great gathering place in the World Trade Center, we have now created what is without doubt going to be the most surveilled place on the entire planet. This is not just ironic. This is tragic.
This whole question of security and the encroachment on our own rights and stuff is reflected, isn't it, in the design and building?
Absolutely. That is a kind of classic paranoid space. I don't know if you read the Times this morning, is that they reported in the lead story that the software for facial recognition has now made great technological leaps. So the NYPD is going to be able to beam a camera on the street and spot whomever they want. The other great tragedy today is Bradley Manning got sent up for 35 years. These people are heroes. I mean, these are the people who are defending us against this institutionalized surveillance, against the NSA, against all these forces who are operating in the dark and taking away our rights. Cities are the places in which people come together to exercise their democratic rights of association. And our duty, I think, is to struggle manfully and womanfully to make sure that those freedoms are preserved.
So how do we do that with your design of the cities? How do we instill in people the sense that they own part of this community and they have to participate in it, in its running? A sense of civic responsibility that doesn't seem to be there. And by civic, I mean all around. This voting. I mean, the voting, we expect one of the smallest, the lowest number of votes in this coming mayoralty election. Now, well, how can that be? How do we design things that do that? I mean, in a way,
it's primarily about the design of institutions. So education and empowerment, I think, are the absolute keys to civic responsibility. If your actions have no outcome, why bother? On the other hand, we are braced by the sight of the Arab Spring. I mean, however much it's degenerated, but
started
people
in a square, right?
Public space was absolutely central to these activities, and people keep coming back and back to Tahrir Square or Taksim Square because it's simply irreplaceable. The idea, here is my credo, here's my most fundamental belief, is that what the city is about is a kind of engine for juxtaposing bodies in space. And if we allow ourselves to be disembodied, if we give up our rights of direct encounter with each other, which is what cities produce, then we're screwed.
I think of the women's movement and the joy of sisterhood and the consciousness raising, the sharing of ideas, or in the last election, the legislation to try to keep African Americans, the blacks, from voting in the South, brought out more and more people to vote. And it was that sense of being together.
Yeah.
And that's what a city should do.
Yeah. And that's what cities are all about and have immemorially immemorially been all about. You know, as again, that's what people were doing in the Agora. They were coming together in order to discuss their present, their past, and their future. And you know, I go back to this argument about bodies. I mean, certainly the feminist movement was very engaged in the idea that one need to understand and liberate and enjoy the rights over one's own body. Right. But it really is. I mean, we're in a completely different culture once we allow ourselves to be disembodied by these political operatives, these security systems, and all the ways in which the big other is trying to keep us apart.
In the planning for parks and the zoning requirements and everything else, do those parks bring people together, or is it where they just go for separate relaxation and activities?
Well, there's nothing wrong with relaxation and baseball. I think something that we've come to appreciate of late, and New York City is a wonderful place in order to have this notion, is the idea that the public, so-called, is not homogeneous. That when we think about parks and recreation and other facilities in the city, we have to think about multiple publics. Right? That the constituency of skateboarders and the constituency of the elderly and the constituency of breakdancers, you know, require very different kinds of spaces, and they share the idea that they have a right to it. You know, these are our citizens, and they should be able to recreate in the way they find best.
I'm very glad that you're teaching, because I hope all of your students come out of that education with the same feelings and passion that you do. And I'm looking forward to the plans that you're going to produce and distribute at the end of the year to how we really make the city more livable.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.